You could smell it the moment you stepped off the morning train. Coffee brewing in chrome percolators, cigarette smoke curling from executive ashtrays, and the sharp chemical tang of mimeograph fluid still drying on the day's memos. If you worked in corporate America between 1930 and the 2000s, you lived inside a world with its own language, its own uniform, and rules nobody ever wrote down, but everyone understood. But here's what nobody talks about anymore. That world didn't just change. It died and was reborn 3 times over 70 years. And if you were there, you remember exactly which version you lived through. In 1930, the American office was a place of desperate quiet. The Great Depression didn't just take jobs, it took voices. Workers who still had positions sat at rows of identical wooden desks in vast open rooms, silent except for the clack of manual typewriters. Because talking meant you weren't working, and not working meant you were gone. The typing pool, that's what they called the rows of women hunched over typewriters, fingers flying at speeds that would shame today's keyboard warriors. By the 1930s, secretarial work had become almost entirely feminized, and these women were expected to know Gregg shorthand, capable of capturing 100 words per minute in symbols that looked like hieroglyphics. Men who'd once dominated clerical work had moved up to management or out to the unemployment lines. Here's what people forget. Offices in the 1930s were factories in disguise. Managers counted keystrokes per hour, monitored how many letters each clerk opened, patrolled between desks to ensure no one was chatting. Some companies even installed partitions between desks, not for privacy, but to prevent conversation. The scientific management craze of the 1920s had turned white-collar work into an assembly line, and when the Depression hit, nobody dared complain. You kept your head down. You kept your job, and if your company went under, which thousands did, you joined the 25% of Americans without work, without prospects, and often without hope. Then came December 7, 1941, and everything changed overnight. The men shipped out, and suddenly corporate America discovered it needed workers it had always ignored. Women flooded into positions from which they'd been barred for generations, not just typing and filing, but engineering, manufacturing, accounting. The government commandeered private industry, handing out war contracts worth billions and essentially nationalizing production. If you worked for a major corporation in the 1940s, you might have found yourself building B-24 bombers instead of automobiles, producing ammunition instead of light bulbs. The Des Moines Ordnance Plant alone employed 19,000 people, many of them women, churning out .30 and .50 caliber machine gun ammunition around the clock. More than 310,000 women worked in the aircraft industry by 1943, representing 65% of the workforce in an industry that had been 99% male just years before. And here's what they won't tell you in the history books. The government didn't just control what companies produced, it set wages, controlled prices, allocated resources, and essentially told private businesses exactly how to operate. Companies that refused could be taken over entirely. It was wartime socialism in capitalist clothing, and it worked because it had to. The concentration of power was staggering. Just 26 firms controlled half of all government-financed industrial facilities by June 1944. The top 168 contractors used more than 83% of all government-owned, contractor-operated plants. This created lasting relationships between government and industry that would define American business for decades, what would eventually be called the military-industrial complex. When the boys came home in 1945, corporate America entered what would become its golden age. But it wasn't the America they'd left. Offices transformed from punishment to privilege. The stark, monitored bullpens of the Depression gave way to landscaped environments with color-coordinated furniture, plants, and comfortable seating. Management had discovered something radical. Workers who weren't miserable were more productive. This was the birth of the organization man, William H. White's 1956 term for the new corporate employee who belonged to the company body and soul. You wore your uniform, dark suit, white shirt, narrow tie, and always a fedora. You took the same train every morning with the same men heading to the same jobs they'd have until retirement. The unspoken promise was simple. Give us your loyalty, your conformity, your life, and we'll give you security, a pension, and a gold watch after 35 years of service. It was a deal millions of men took without hesitation, because for the first time in American history, the white-collar middle class could aspire to genuine prosperity. IBM exemplified this promise. The company maintained a strict no-layoff policy for regular employees and promised jobs for life if you performed adequately. General Electric, General Motors, Kodak, Coca-Cola, America's industrial giants all operated on the same principle. You didn't just work for these companies, you belonged to them, from company housing to company insurance to company retirement parties. But there was a cost nobody mentioned. White saw it clearly. These organization men sacrificed individual initiative and creativity for a soothing sense of belonging. They worked in a system that actively discouraged standing out, thinking differently, or challenging group opinion. The Protestant ethic of individualism had been replaced by a social ethic that stressed cooperation and management. Yet this system worked spectacularly well for 2 decades. American productivity soared, the middle class expanded, the suburbs grew, and if the price was conformity, most people paid it gladly because they remembered the alternative, the breadlines, the bank failures, the desperation their parents had endured in the 1930s. In July 1961, IBM introduced a typewriter that would revolutionize office work, the Selectric. Instead of the traditional basket of type bars that jammed when you typed too fast, it featured a golf ball-shaped typing element that rotated and tilted into position. This innovation seems small until you understand what it meant. For the first time, you could change fonts in the same document just by swapping the ball. You could type faster without jamming. The paper stayed still while the mechanism moved, eliminating alignment issues that had plagued secretaries for decades. By 1978, IBM held 94% of the electric typewriter market because of the Selectric. Sales in the first 30 days exceeded the 6-month forecast. This wasn't just a better mousetrap, it was the tool that made the modern office possible. But an even bigger revolution came in 1959, when a company called Haloid introduced something called the Xerox 914, the first plain paper copier. Before this, making copies meant carbon paper, mimeographs, or expensive photostatic processes. The 914 could make sharp, permanent copies on ordinary paper, and it changed everything. Xerox expected customers would make about 2,000 copies per month. Users regularly made 100,000. Before the 914, Americans made 20 million copies per year. By 1966, they made 14 billion. The explosion in copying created a new way of working. Suddenly, information could flow freely throughout organizations, memos could be distributed widely, and the paperwork deluge of modern corporate life began in earnest. The early 1960s looked like the 1950s in a gray flannel suit. Offices were formal, hierarchical, and overwhelmingly male and white. Women worked as secretaries, not executives. Smoking wasn't just permitted, it was expected. with 42% of American adults puffing away at their desks in meetings and during conferences. And the drinking. Oh, the drinking. If you worked in advertising on Madison Avenue in the 1960s, the world Mad Men would later romanticize, the three-martini lunch wasn't an exaggeration. Jerry Della Femina, who worked in the industry for 50 years, confirmed that Mad Men actually understated the drinking. The bartender would see us walking through the door and start shaking martinis. The first would arrive as we sat down, the second without asking, then the third while we looked at menus. Bottles in desk drawers weren't the exception, but the rule. Della Femina kept an open bar in his office stocked with 10 to 15 bottles, and some employees would pour a shot at 9 a.m. and slug it down before starting work. It was a business of drinking, and for good reason. Business was conducted over drinks, deals were sealed over drinks, and the expense account made it all tax-deductible as a legitimate business expense. But beneath the surface, everything was shifting. The counterculture movement that exploded in the late 1960s challenged every assumption corporate America held dear. Young people rejected conformity, questioned authority, and sometimes literally tried to levitate the Pentagon. The phrase, "turn on, tune in, drop out," became a mantra for a generation that saw the corporate ladder as a treadmill to nowhere. The workplace hadn't caught up yet. As strange as it seems now, workplace etiquette in the 1960s included behaviors that would end careers today. Rampant sexual harassment, racial discrimination so normalized it wasn't even discussed, and a rigid hierarchy where women made coffee while men made decisions. Then came the 1970s, and the golden age collapsed. The decade opened with a recession, stumbled into stagflation, that economic impossibility of high inflation combined with high unemployment, and closed with another recession. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 sent crude oil prices skyrocketing, triggering a wage price spiral that ravaged American manufacturing. Corporate America discovered it wasn't invincible. Japanese and European companies, recovered from World War II, suddenly competed effectively against U.S. firms that had grown complacent. American manufacturing faced higher costs and increased competition simultaneously. Companies responded by cutting labor costs, automating with robotics, moving production overseas to countries with cheaper labor and fewer regulations. The 1970s introduced Americans to concepts they'd never seriously confronted: declining living standards, double-digit inflation, gasoline lines, and the unsettling reality that their children might not live better than they did. By November 1979, only 19% of Americans were satisfied with the direction of the country, compared to 71% satisfaction at the 1999 peak. For corporate workers, the unspoken contract began to fray. Mass layoffs, which had been seen as signs of failure in the 1950s and 1960s, became strategic decisions. The government, seeking to make American companies more competitive with overseas rivals, relaxed regulations and weakened union protections. The era of job security was ending, and almost nobody saw it coming. If the 1970s broke corporate America's promises, the 1980s burned the contract altogether. The decade started in recession, with unemployment hitting levels unseen since the Depression. But by mid-decade, wealth was growing. Not for everyone, just for those who already had it. Salaries for the highest earners rose 80% throughout the decade. For the other 90%, wage increases never topped 3%. This disparity created a new creature, the Yuppie, the young urban professional. Whether you picture Gordon Gekko from Wall Street or envision a BMW driving MBA with a brick-sized cellular phone, The Yuppie became the defining image of 1980s success. The term started as an insult, a mocking jab at arrogant, undeserving rich people. But the label stuck and evolved. These were young people, often just in their 20s, flooding Wall Street and the finance world with starting salaries around $70,000, about $190,000 in today's dollars. They wore the latest power suits with shoulder pads, drove luxury cars, and seemed to have money to burn on wine bars, sushi restaurants, and compact discs. Oliver Stone captured the era's essence in his 1987 film Wall Street, with Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko declaring, "Greed, for lack of a better word, is good." Stone intended the film as a cautionary tale about the corruption and emptiness of pursuing easy money. Instead, it inspired a generation to get into stock trading and even Gekko's fashion. The suspenders, the slicked-back hair, the ruthless confidence became aspirational. But the real story of 1980s corporate America was happening away from Wall Street's glamour, in boardrooms where a new philosophy was taking hold: downsizing. General Electric Chairman Jack Welch earned the nickname Neutron Jack for massive layoffs that left buildings standing but people gone. CEO Al Dunlap became known as Chainsaw Al for the same reason. From 1981 through 1990, roughly 20 million American workers were displaced from full-time jobs, not because companies failed, but because corporations decided they didn't need them. The 1980s also brought personal computers to every desk. IBM introduced its PC in August 1981 for $1,500, and the machine that brought computing to the masses used off-the-shelf parts and an open architecture that anyone could copy. By the end of the decade, offices that had been defined by typewriters, filing cabinets, and paper were being transformed by screens, keyboards, and floppy disks. The fax machine, a technology dating back to the 18th century, finally became ubiquitous in the 1980s as the fastest-growing area of office automation. In high school in the late 1980s, owning a fax machine seemed like the ultimate status symbol. It promised instant communication, though anyone who used one remembered the paper that faded to blank, the unexpected lines running through copies, and the distinctive thermal paper smell. Somewhere in the chaos of the 1980s, corporate America also dismantled the retirement security that had defined the organization man era. In 1978, Congress passed the Revenue Act, which included a provision that became Section 401(k) of the Internal Revenue Code. The first 401(k) plans appeared in 1981, and they changed everything. Traditional defined benefit pensions, where the company guaranteed you a specific monthly payment for life after retirement, started disappearing. Companies replaced them with 401(k) plans that shifted the responsibility for retirement savings from the employer to the employee. Why the switch? Companies saved enormous amounts of money. Pension plans were expensive and unpredictable. The company bore all the risk of market downturns and had to keep funding plans even when times were tough. With 401(k)s, the company could match employee contributions or not, and if the stock market crashed, well, that was the employee's problem. The symbolic gold watch retirement ceremony, representing 35 or 40 years with the same company, became an artifact of a dying world. By the 1990s, young workers no longer assumed they'd stay with one employer for decades, and companies no longer pretended to offer that security. The era of corporate loyalty, which had defined American business since World War II, was over. The 90s, tech boom and dot-com dreams. The 1990s started with recession and ended with irrational exuberance. The decade's defining characteristic was the rise of the Internet and the dot-com boom that made and destroyed fortunes with breathtaking speed. Companies like Amazon, 1994, Yahoo, 1994, and eBay, 1995, sprouted daily, and suddenly anything with a .com suffix could attract millions in venture capital funding, regardless of whether it had revenue, profits, or even a coherent business plan. The NASDAQ Composite, home to tech stocks, soared from under 800 in 1995 to nearly 5,000 by March 2000, a 600% increase. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan warned about irrational exuberance in December 1996, but nobody listened. Stocks dipped briefly, then soared to even more absurd heights. If you worked in Silicon Valley in the 1990s, employee stock options became the currency of choice. Companies cash poor but rich in potential offered meaningful ownership stakes to early employees, dangling the promise that when the company went public or sold for millions, everyone would get rich together. And it worked for a while. The number of American workers holding stock options vaulted from 1 million in 1992 to 10 million in 2000. The first 3,000 Facebook employees would eventually enjoy about $23 billion at the company's IPO. Stock options were the lottery tickets that occasionally paid off spectacularly. The 1990s also brought casual Fridays, the revolutionary concept that you could wear khakis and a polo shirt to work one day a week. The trend traced back to 1960s Hawaii, where the Hawaiian Fashion Guild promoted aloha wear as acceptable business attire. But casual Fridays went mainstream in the 1990s, championed by tech companies that valued comfort over conformity. By 1994, half of the 1,000 largest U.S. companies, including General Motors, Ford, General Electric, Chrysler, and Mobil, observed casual Fridays. Levi Strauss even created a guide for casual business wear in 1992 and sent it to 25,000 HR departments, helping to define what business casual actually meant, with photos of professionals combining Oxford shirts with chinos or polo shirts with raw jeans. What started as a Friday perk gradually became daily practice in many workplaces. The cubicle, from utopia to Dilbert. No discussion of modern corporate America would be complete without addressing its most infamous innovation, the cubicle. In 1968, Herman Miller introduced the Action Office II system, designed by inventor Robert Probst. Probst had spent the 1960s studying how offices actually worked, consulting with mathematicians, psychologists, and anthropologists. His conclusion was damning. Today's office is a wasteland. It saps vitality, blocks talent, frustrates accomplishment. The Action Office II was supposed to liberate workers. It featured modular components that could be reconfigured for different tasks, multiple surfaces at different heights for sitting and standing work, and partitions that gave privacy without complete isolation. Probst envisioned an active workspace where people moved around, changed positions, and interacted naturally. What actually happened was predictable. Accountants and office planners figured out they could cram more workers into less space by shrinking Probst's vision to minimum dimensions and lining up workers in rows with 90-degree walls. By the late 1970s, cubicle farms dominated corporate America. Probst lived long enough to see his utopian mission become a Dilbert punchline, and reportedly expressed regret before his death in 2000. The cubicle, intended to give workers flexibility and dignity, instead became the symbol of corporate dehumanization, a padded cell where you performed repetitive tasks under fluorescent lights until retirement or downsizing, whichever came first. When the new millennium began, people felt optimistic about the future. But that hopeful mood didn't last long after the technology market crashed and many new businesses failed. By March 2000, investors realized most dot-coms had no path to profitability. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates, putting pressure on margins for leveraged tech companies. The Nasdaq peaked near 5,048 in March 2000, then plummeted. Over the following months, countless dot-coms imploded, shedding 80 to 90% of their value. Pets.com, Webvan, and Boo.com became cautionary tales. WorldCom, once the second-largest long-distance telecommunications company, revealed it had cooked the books to inflate earnings by $3.8 billion. And then came Enron. The collapse of Enron in December 2001 became the most complex white-collar crime investigation in FBI history. The energy company filed for bankruptcy after news of widespread internal fraud became public, wiping out $74 billion in shareholder value in just 4 years. CEO Kenneth Lay and other executives went to prison for conspiracy, fraud, and filing false documents. The scandals, WorldCom, Enron, Tyco, revealed the dark side of 1990s corporate excess. CEOs who'd been hailed as visionaries turned out to be criminals. The stock options that were supposed to align executives' interests with shareholders instead created incentives for fraud and manipulation. Congress responded with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, aimed at increasing corporate accountability and transparency in financial reporting. The era of assuming corporate executives would police themselves was over. As the decade progressed, another shift occurred: the Open Office Plan. Google's 2005 renovation of its Mountain View headquarters signaled the dawn of a new era, issuing cubicles for lofty, light-filled collaborative spaces that resembled neighborhoods more than offices. When Facebook opened its Frank Gehry-designed Menlo Park headquarters in 2015, the company claimed it housed 2,800 employees in the world's largest open floor plan. The theory was collaboration and transparency. The reality? Studies showed people in open offices took nearly 2/3 more sick leave, reported greater unhappiness and stress, and were less productive than those with more privacy. A 2018 Harvard study found open offices reduced face-to-face interaction by 70% while increasing email and messaging by 50%, exactly the opposite of their intended purpose. But open offices were cheap, reducing the average space per employee globally from 225 square feet in 2010 to 176 square feet by 2013. At the largest companies, this translated to hundreds of millions in annual savings. The lesson was clear: corporate America would keep doing what saved money, regardless of whether it helped workers. 70 years. From Depression desperation to wartime transformation. From gray flannel conformity to Yuppie excess. From cubicle farms to open plan chaos. If you lived through any piece of this story, if you remember mimeograph fluid or three-martini lunches, if you received a gold watch or stock options, if you worked in a typing pool or a dot-com startup, you witnessed one of the great transformations in American life. The corporate America of 1930 promised nothing except survival. The corporate America of 1960 promised security, loyalty, and a comfortable retirement if you conformed and kept your head down. The corporate America of 2000 promised nothing except opportunity and the understanding that you were on your own. What we lost was certainty, The knowledge that a job meant lifetime employment, that a company would take care of you, that hard work guaranteed security. What we gained was freedom from rigid hierarchies, from mandatory fedoras, from pretending greed wasn't the point. But here's the thing about corporate America. It never stops changing, because it was never really about buildings or dress codes or benefits packages. It was always about people trying to make a living, provide for their families, and find meaning in work that consumed most of their waking hours. The typewriters became computers. The three-martini lunches became protein shake meetings. The gold watches became vested stock options. The promises changed, but the essential bargain remained the same. Show up, do the work, hope the company needs you tomorrow more than you need them today. And if you were there, really there, in those offices that smelled like coffee and cigarette smoke and ambition, you remember. You remember exactly how it felt to be part of something bigger than yourself, even when that something broke its promises, betrayed your loyalty, or simply disappeared in a puff of dot-com smoke. That's corporate America. That's the story nobody tells anymore, because everyone who lived it already knows.